The font you should use is called Chantel Sans. It's casual, balanced, very legible, and has some really unique features. It's the creation of artist Chantel Martin and the type designers Stephen Nixon and Anya Danilova. And it was inspired by Comic Sans.
One of the early things she said was something like, "Do you want to make the new Comic Sans?" And I was like, wow, that is an incredible prompt. It's like a super iconic font, so I was really eager to do this with her.
It's free on Google Fonts. Download or use it today. Links are beneath this video. But to understand what designing the new Comic Sans even means, we need to unpack what the original was all about. So in this video, let's talk about how and why Comic Sans became the world's most infamous and popular font, whether it deserved the hate, and how it completely changed how artists like Chantel think about type. The story of Comic Sans starts with this yellow cartoon dog. Rover was an early virtual assistant predating Clippy in an obscure program called Microsoft Bob. Vincent Conner, who worked at Microsoft, saw Rover's speech balloon in Times New Roman, and something didn't quite feel right. The tone was off. Using graphic novels as inspiration, he designed Comic Sans as an alternative. Now, comic book lettering is a very specific genre with its own history and conventions, and Comic Sans doesn't follow these. The proportions hew closer to Arial than to the fonts of Comicraft or Blambot that later defined digital comic lettering. Regardless, Comic Sans didn't end up making the deadline to ship with Microsoft Bob, but shortly thereafter it appeared in other kid-focused applications. But it would soon reach a much, much wider audience. Comic Sans came bundled with Microsoft Publisher, the user-friendly desktop publishing suite. It proved popular enough to then ship with later editions of Windows 95, and after that, Microsoft Office. But it went even beyond the Microsoft ecosystem. What really clinched the deal for the total dominance of Comic Sans was its inclusion in the Core Fonts for the Web project. In the early days of the web, there weren't standards for embedding custom fonts, and dial-up speeds were too slow to make it practical. These technical constraints limited type choices for web designers, because if you wanted to use a specific font, there was no guarantee a user had it installed, and if not, the font would fall back to the system default. Microsoft dominated the PC market, and Core Fonts for the Web was their strategy to make Microsoft fonts the default for everyone. They picked a small handful of their greatest hits and distributed them as freeware for both Windows and Macintosh. Apple saw the writing on the wall and later bundled them with their own operating system. So, for a good few years, every website was effectively restricted to just 10 fonts, and alongside standards like Arial and Verdana was Comic Sans. So Comic Sans had basically universal distribution, but also crucially for a time it also seemed to have universal appeal. So much so that it became impossible to escape, as much as Who Let the Dogs Out or the Black Eyed Peas. It was all over every GeoCities and Angelfire page, every chain email forward from your mother in Outlook Express, offline, every church bulletin, class handout and bake sale flyer, Comic Sans. Then small businesses jumped on the bandwagon, splashing it across billboards, shop signage, and restaurant menus. But then it started showing up in places usually reserved for more serious typographic choices: medical and legal documents, official reports, and even at least one ambulance and a war memorial. This isn't to say there isn't a time and place for Comic Sans, but suddenly it seemed like that time was all the time, and the place was everywhere. Jean shorts and a box of wine sound perfect for a backyard barbecue, but those same choices might raise a few eyebrows on the Oscars red carpet or the wine list of a Michelin-starred restaurant. This frequent inappropriate use is particularly ironic when you consider the origin of Comic Sans. Times New Roman was too formal for cartoon speech bubbles, but Comic Sans was an equally jarring choice for the official announcement of the discovery of the Higgs boson. The backlash that followed should be no big surprise. In 1999, two designers started a Ban Comic Sans campaign. Many blogs sprang up, cataloging its multiple crimes and misdemeanors. Of course, designers had hated other fonts in the past. In the 1970s, many decried the use of souvenir as tacky and overused, but what made this backlash different was it wasn't only designers trash-talking Comic Sans. In the 2000s, skateboarding exploded into the mainstream thanks to Tony Hawk Pro Skater for the PlayStation. In a similar way, the mass adoption of home computers and TrueType fonts meant that many people were now becoming aware of fonts for the first time. And just as, seemingly overnight, everyone's uncle knew what a half-pipe was, font hating went from a niche interest for industry professionals to part of popular culture. There have been many words written online about why people hate Comic Sans, so I don't want to flog a dead horse. But as I was finishing this script, an academic book was published called From ASCII Art to Comic Sans, and the author, Corinne Wagner, neatly outlines the three main arguments used by haters of Comic Sans. The usage argument.
I just think it's overused. Like, it's in a lot of places where it doesn't belong. It's fine if it's like a first grader's book report, but why is it on restaurant menus and like business signs? It's weird.
The aesthetic argument.
Genuinely, I don't understand why Comic Sans exists. Like, there's so many better fonts that you could use than this ugly, curvy, irregular looking font. Why don't you just use Arial if you're going to use a bad font?
The sociological argument.
I think it's pretty bad. I think if you're using Comic Sans, it's a desecration of the good art of graphic design and the labor that people put into designing good things, and it offends people with eyes.
Professor Wagner argues that while there were overused and ugly fonts before, none received as visceral a reaction as Comic Sans. When it comes to the sociological argument, there's a bit more substance there. She suggests this wasn't a two-sided culture war between designers and non-designers. Instead, it can be seen more as a three-tier hierarchy. On the top tier, we had professional designers who saw the pervasiveness of Comic Sans as a sort of canary in the coal mine. This was a sign that technology was democratizing publishing for better or worse. Designers were traditionally the gatekeepers of typographic taste, since before, only they had the technical skills for typesetting. Now, PCs were making this available to the masses, and these folks were making choices completely ignorant of the rules. It was a difficult and painful transition for the industry, and Comic Sans became a kind of scapegoat. At the bottom tier, there were everyday people just happily using Comic Sans because they liked it.
I just think they're neat.
But in the middle, heckling from the sidelines, were armchair designers and hipsters who looked down on normies who used Comic Sans. Especially online, mocking Comic Sans was low-hanging fruit. It was an easy way to try to appear sophisticated and savvy about design, even if your understanding was only surface level. This reminds me of what happened with the film Sideways. Paul Giamatti played a wine snob who loved Pinot Noir and passionately hated Merlot.
I am not drinking any Merlot!
Following the movie, Merlot sales dipped while Pinot Noir sales increased because people walked away from the movie with a simple rule of thumb. Merlot bad, Pinot Noir good, without really grasping any nuance or understanding why. As Comic Sans designer Vincent Conner has said,
if you love Comic Sans, you don't know much about typography. And if you hate it, you don't know very much about typography either. And you should probably get another hobby.
Is Comic Sans a beautiful font? Is it a great font?
No. No, man.
Not in my opinion, but it doesn't need to be either of those things to be an important font. After almost 3 decades of scorn, of endless roasting of its many flaws, I think it's time that Comic Sans got its due for its redeeming features. But before I ruin my professional reputation by extolling the virtues of Comic Sans, I want to let you know that I'm starting a newsletter. It will be free and sent out 4 times a year. This will be somewhere I can talk about topics that don't warrant their own videos, including some awesome free fonts like Chantal Sans. Defaults matter, and until 2007, the default font for Microsoft Office was Times New Roman, a font originally designed for this newspaper in 1929. You don't need design training to get an intuitive sense that fonts convey a certain tone, a vibe, and Times New Roman came across as somewhat formal, maybe a bit uptight. It worked well for business and official documents, but computers were also becoming household items by the late 90s. People wanted to print stuff for school, social events, and other casual settings. So they wanted a font that felt easygoing, not too serious. Comic Sans was like shifting from corporate speak to chatting with a friend. Now, I've got a pet theory. When Microsoft made the switch to Calibri as their default font in 2007, the popularity of Comic Sans had to be a factor. Those rounded corners on Calibri, the font's designer deleted them at last minute before submitting it to Microsoft. He thought the technology at the time couldn't pull it off, but he threw in a few samples of the rounded design as an afterthought. Microsoft chose the rounded version, partly because their font rendering had improved, but also I think because it makes it feel friendlier. And the public's embrace of Comic Sans over Times New Roman showed that many users wanted a warmer, more personal feeling font. Calibri strikes a balance between Times New Roman's button-up suit seriousness and Comic Sans Hawaiian shirt casualness. Think of Calibri as the polo shirt and khakis of fonts. There are many ways to classify fonts, by style, features, you name it, but one approach is to sort them by function. On one hand, we have body or text faces, fonts like these designed for long paragraphs of text. On the other hand, display fonts like these are often more eccentric in style or bold and punchy, suited for short bursts of text like headlines. Just as you wouldn't use Arial Regular for a billboard, you wouldn't want to print a 5,000-word essay in Impact, not only because of the cost of printer ink, but also because readability would be horrible. Comic Sans filled a niche somewhere in the middle. It's readable enough for long-form text, but it also serves as an eye-catching headline, especially in bold. Beyond its versatility, it was also user-friendly for people just learning to use fonts for the first time.
If you set a sentence in Arial and you change it to Comic Sans, it was designed so that it acts how you want it to act as a user, but it makes you feel a totally different way to read it. Right there, it's a really successful font.
For its era, Comic Sans had quite good legibility. The wonkiness and inconsistency of the letter shapes ended up being beneficial to people with reading disorders like dyslexia, especially when compared with fonts with more traditional letter harmony. The roomier spacing between letters and its approachable vibe made it a useful tool for a significant number of people struggling with reading. When I spoke with Chantel, she told me about her experience growing up.
In one of my primary schools, I never passed my spelling tests. Flash forward, you go to secondary school and, you have those terrible things where in English class, they just make you read out loud. And, you have to read a book that has this very intimidating small typing that isn't friendly and it isn't welcoming and it isn't accessible. And then you have to read out loud, which is incredibly hard for you. And then again, you're punished if you don't do it correctly. These earlier years of my life where people were usually reading a bunch and kind of building that foundation, I didn't have that because I completely avoided that. Coming across Comic Sans as a young adult, just the ease and the accessibility that typeface has and the permission it's given people to be able to read and keep their attention so that they can get through a whole comic or a whole book. It's done great things.
Now, the research is mixed on how much Comic Sans and other specialized fonts help with dyslexia, at least in formal group studies. Even if it didn't work wonders for everyone, for those who did find it helpful, it opened doors to reading that might have felt unapproachable. That's something that deserves some recognition. Like any pop culture icon of a certain age, Comic Sans has had rip-offs, reboots, and reimaginings over the years. So before we talk about what makes Chantel Sans different, let's take a quick look at a few highlights and low points. Comic Sans certainly has its haters, but for me, much, much worse is Apple's 2004 clone font, Chalkboard. It's the most cynical knockoff Apple has ever shipped, the least necessary font of all time. Next. Not unlike George Lucas and his questionable special editions, in 2010 Microsoft and Monotype released Comic Sans Pro, which was just the same font but with fancy OpenType features. Though I'm not sure who was clamoring to see a version of Comic Sans with swashes, small caps, and typographic embellishments. Two contemporary takes worth mentioning are Comic Code by Toshio Megari, a monospaced reimagining of Comic Sans for coding, which is a fun take with a niche appeal, and Comic Neue by Craig Rosinski, which aimed to smooth out some of the original's wonkiness, but in my opinion, it loses a lot of the playfulness and visual interest of the original and ends up being a pretty bland substitute. Chantel Sans is substantially different from all the examples I just listed, which started with Comic Sans and then added, tweaked, or subtracted, but at their foundation were built on the same font. But like Comic Sans was inspired by comic book lettering at a vibes level, but not really comic book lettering in effect, Chantel Sans is inspired by Comic Sans, but is doing something new and separate while aiming to carry the torch for some of its best qualities. So after just having defended Comic Sans, here's why, with one exception which I'll get to, you should stop using it and start using Chantel Sans instead. Comic Sans is a product uniquely of its time. It was born from a workflow that has never been repeated since for a major font release. Firstly, it was drawn with a mouse, a ball mouse to be exact, since it predates the invention of the optical mouse. If you weren't around to experience these, just know that they were a lot clunkier than what we use today. Vincent Conner drew the font directly in Macromedia Fontographer, the go-to type design program of its day, using the freehand tool, so he had to draw each letter over and over again until it looked about how he wanted. You may know Macromedia better for Flash, and the strokes of Comic Sans have a look that's reminiscent of early Flash animations. Conner has said he churned out Comic Sans in a mere 3 days. Chantel Sans is different. Dolly Parton once said, "It takes a lot of money to look this cheap." Well, in the case of Chantel Sans, it took a lot of careful work to look this casual.
I didn't want to have to ask Chantel to write the Bible or give her an overwhelming amount of work to do. To keep it pretty light, we just did like 3 all caps pangrams, 3 mixed case pangrams or pi to 100 digits, and then a bunch of like symbols just to capture some of the basic tendencies that her hand will have when writing with a marker.
It was a long process to normalize the height, width, and spacing to behave more like type, but without erasing the imperfections and quirks that make it feel handwritten.
There are real challenges for making something that has warmth to it, but is a normal font for everyday use.
The variable version of Chantel Sans even has sliders for informality and bounce, so that you can fine-tune how much you want it to feel like type or like a quickly scribbled handwritten note. Plus, those features are just fun, and more fonts should be fun. Comic Sans may not lack personality, but it isn't personal. The idiosyncrasies of the letter forms aren't a reflection of Vincent Conner's handwriting, but of technical restraints. But Chantel Sans is deeply tied to the artist Chantel Martin. Her writing is an intrinsic part of her work. Creating a font as an extension of her work and artistic identity makes perfect sense.
I think I realized the power of words when I realized that words are made up of lines, and what are lines? Lines can be drawings. And as an artist, do I not have that creative license? So that's when I realized being dyslexic is a little bit of a superpower, because I can be very free in the way that I write and in the way that I manipulate the words. Whereas if I was coming from more of a linear perspective, it might be harder to write upside down or backwards or like spin that around. And so words can also be a tool that you perform with.
A key factor in Comic Sans' omnipresence was the limited font options of the early web. Today, the situation is totally different. There's a seemingly endless array of font options, whether commercial and paid, or free and open licensed. Of course, Google Fonts, which now boasts over 1,500 font families, is the most popular and easiest way to use fonts online for free. And the best part is, after years of minimalism, fonts are getting fun again. This is thanks to a fresh wave of talent amongst type designers. There are so many unique and expressive options available, often for free, and more are being added every day. As a result, there are fewer and fewer good reasons to choose Comic Sans. Chantel Sans offers the same friendly and approachable tone, but in a more finely crafted, authentic, and modern package. To me, it's clearly the superior choice, except when you don't want just a friendly handwritten style of font, you want Comic Sans. Every once in a while, a product transcends its entire category to become a cultural icon. These are not just one of many, they're singular. It means something very specific to wear Crocs that's different from wearing other shoes. For better or worse, it becomes a loaded choice, but it's still something you can choose. After 30 years, Comic Sans may be the most frequently, deliberately selected font from a drop-down menu in history. Most of the core fonts for the web have faded into obscurity. Could you even pick Underlay Mono from a lineup? But Comic Sans endures. Not just as a font, but as a meme that's woven itself into our popular culture. Comic Sans is having a kind of renaissance, especially amongst Gen Z and Gen Alpha as part of the romanticization of early internet culture and its rebirth as Y2K aesthetic styles. It can be used ironically or sincerely in a very meta way. There was no way that Vincent Conner could have guessed that when he threw together Comic Sans in the length of a long weekend. It could have easily ended up as just another novelty font on an obscure CD-ROM of kids software, which is part of what makes releasing a font into the wild such a strange and daunting experience. I asked Stephen and Chantel how they felt about that.
I guess we can all imagine unfortunate places to see our fonts, and that's the scary side of open source type and making something available to the world.
You're putting it out there and people will probably use it really badly, but at least they're using it and creating and like making things.
I definitely hope to someday see one of my fonts used on like a falafel shop or something. Chantel Sans is definitely meant for hopefully wide appeal.
I love the name Chantel Sans and I love that this will kind of outlive me. And you know, the thing with dyslexia, it's all very different. And others who are coming from a similar place to me will hopefully feel that benefit too.
Big thanks to my supporters on Patreon who help make this channel possible, and shout out to the Answers in Progress crew and Nation Squid for their brilliant cameos. Huge thanks to Chantel and Stephen for speaking with me. There was so much that I couldn't fit in this video, including the fascinating process of adding Cyrillic to this font. There's a great article on chantelsans.com breaking down the entire process in more detail. You can download it on the website, or in Google Docs you can just click on the font menu and select more fonts and find Chantel Sans there. I hope this made you think deeper about Comic Sans. My name is Linus, thank you for watching, and I hope I'll see you in a future video.